Welcome to Artificiality. This is Dave Edwards. In this episode, I have the pleasure of interviewing Chelsea Barabas, a PhD candidate at MIT's Media Lab. We talk about her historical work of looking at data and bias in the criminal justice system, and a more recent work of applying concepts from anthropology called Studying Up to the data science world. I think Chelsea's work has wide applications well beyond her primary focus. Hope you enjoy the interview. Thanks for joining us on the podcast. It's a real pleasure to have you. I guess I'd like to start off with a bit of, can you give a bit of background about how you got into this field in general?
Sure. So I'm currently a PhD candidate at the MIT Media Lab, and I've actually just started my PhD program there. I've been at MIT for about 6.5 years, actually, at this point. I initially came to MIT as a graduate student and got a master's degree in the comparative media studies program. And during that time, I was a research assistant in a group called the Center for Civic Media, which is housed in the Media Lab. And that's actually when I started, I guess, my work at the intersection of, at the time, what was called big data, or what you might consider now AI, algorithmic decision-making, and civil rights protections in various different contexts. My master's degree was focused primarily on looking at how hiring and recruitment practices were changing, specifically in the tech sector, where during 2013 through 2015, when I was doing my master's degree, the tech sector was coming under pressure for the lack of diversity of their technical workforce. And I was really interested in the technological solutions that the tech industry was building for itself to try to address that issue. So that opened up a whole world for me around kind of looking at how data and different decision-making aids were being used, particularly in response to a social critique, in this case, lack of diversity, and really kind of conceived as a solution to this issue of bias or implicit bias in the way that we hire and recruit people for the tech industry. So that's really where I kind of started broadly with kind of questions around AI, automation, discrimination, and civil rights issues. And then a few years later, I would say in 2016, in the wake of ProPublica's expose around the COMPAS algorithm, which is a pretrial risk assessment tool that's been used to inform pretrial release decisions that are made for people who've been arrested and now are awaiting trial. That story broke in 2016, and that was the moment in which I sort of also got interested in kind of how some of the same narratives and conversations around bias were being echoed in that space. And I got interested in kind of exploring particularly the response that the academic and the tech sector kind of had to ProPublica's initial expose in that area. So I've been working specifically around kind of pretrial risk assessments and more broadly algorithmic reforms in criminal justice since then.
The work that you did in that era, there's a great video that was recorded at a conference in 2018 around the research that you wrote, and there's a great op-ed in the Times that you and a couple of your other colleagues wrote, and I'll put those links in the show notes. I was staggered by some of the data that came out of that related to the public safety assessment system. And one of the things that you wrote about in there, and you have to help me make sure that I've got this correct. You talked about the different accuracy rates based on whether the system predicts whether someone will be violent in a pretrial period, right? So just a little bit of background. These systems are used in the criminal justice system and provide an algorithmic prediction for a judge to determine whether a particular person who has been accused of a crime would commit a violent crime while they're waiting for trial. And the data that you showed said that for those who are predicted to be nonviolent, the algorithm is 98% accurate. But then on the opposite side, for those who are predicted to be violent, it's actually 92% inaccurate. Did I get that right out of your data?
Well, you're speaking to, I think, the general, challenge that we outline, which is the challenge of predicting rare incidents such as violence for individuals who are trying to wait for their day in court. And yes, the key thing that we're trying to bring out there is that when you're looking for a very specific and rare type of incident, and particularly an incident like violent crime, which by its very nature is often not a premeditated act, it proves very challenging to be able to predict those types of rare incidences. And the reason for that being is we just don't have a lot of, it's hard to find patterns in things that don't happen that often. And arguably, there might not even be one that we can discern by looking at historical data that's available. And so as a result, we end up we make predictions, but particularly for things like violence, those predictions end up um, being predicted within very broad ranges. And what I mean by that is most of these predictive algorithms that are used, they're making predictions not as a specific point estimate of, okay, Dave has a 22% likelihood of being arrested for a violent crime. It's going to say something more like Dave is somewhere between, 15 and 22% accurate, or 22% likely to be committing a crime that's violent. And when it comes to these rare incidences, those ranges are really big. So for you, it might be something between 15 and 60% likely, something like that. And for me, it might be something like between 20 and 65% likely. It's really tough to make a difference, like distinguish those two people and their actual likelihood because those ranges are so big. And so that's the challenge is it's really tough to actually try to profile or distinguish people according to their likelihood of committing those types of rare acts over time.
And how are those systems tuned in terms of accuracy? So are they weighting more towards the false positives or the false negatives?
Yeah, I think that's actually probably what you're touching on, which I think is the second part of that argument that we had, which is yeah, so when these tools like rather than optimize so that the tool is making the most accurate prediction it could possibly make, which for things that are as rare as violent crime would just mean by default you would rate everybody as low risk because the reality is that most people, the vast majority of people don't commit violent crimes. So um, and we don't have any right now like strong factors that send strong signals to help us differentiate those who will and those who won't. So yeah, if we were trying to just be as accurate as possible, we would probably just release everybody. But instead of doing that, what we do is we try to make fine-grained distinctions that often mask how small the difference is between what we consider a low risk person and what we consider a high risk person. So the public safety assessment, which is one of the most popular pretrial risk assessments in use today, certainly does that. I've been in workshops where the violence score is being explained by like a technical assistant to the public safety assessment folks, and they'll say things like a high risk person is 3 times more likely to commit a violent crime than a low risk person on our tool. That might be true, but what that's masking is the actual difference, like percentage difference in likelihood is maybe 5 percentage points. Like the person who is rated as high risk might have, be somewhere between like 5 and 8% likelihood of committing a violent crime. Whereas somebody who's low risk might be somewhere between 2 and 4% likelihood of committing that violent crime. So both of them are extremely unlikely to commit those crimes. But the difference between 2% and 6% likely is a 3 times greater likelihood, right? But those percent likelihoods are very small.
But you say it's interesting. One of the things you wrote, you talked about a judge talking about not wanting to be the judge that lets somebody go, and then that person commits a violent crime, in their pretrial period.
Mm-hmm.
And then you also talk about the data where you said it's not uncommon for states to lock up 30% of people in that trial period, and which just feels like we're not optimizing the system for the accused. We're optimizing the system, for the judge and the judicial system
Mm-hmm.
to make sure that they're they have as much accuracy as possible. Meaning, you want to put as many people as possible in there to make sure you capture any possible violent criminal in that period, someone who would commit a violent crime during that period, rather than try and release as many people who will not commit a violent crime.
Yeah, I mean, so I think one of the things we really wanted to look at was, we really wanted to dig into the ability of risk assessments to be able to predict violent crime, because that is what people say they're most concerned about. And I've done
Hmm.
interviews with judges in courtrooms, and time and again, that is what comes up is people saying, I'd like to release more people, but I'm afraid that if I release them, they're going to make headlines for some violent crime, and that's going to be the end of my career as a judge. Um, so we really do zone in on, like, can risk assessments actually predict violence? Our answer is not really. But I think the other big problem or issue that doesn't get nearly as much attention around this is that I think it's sort of in response to that, what these risk assessments also try to predict is any new arrest that an individual might face if released from jail. And that's often called a new criminal activity risk score. And that's a stand in for anything as minor as driving on a suspended license, or low level drug offenses, possession, things like that. And what I think often happens in these situations is that judges end up conflating the likelihood of seeing somebody in their courtroom again with this public safety threat. They think, oh, if I keep seeing the same person over and over, this is somebody is a public safety, a threat to our community. I should lock them up. So I think there should be much more conversation about whether or not these risk assessments help judges kind of give them pause to kind of question whether or not that assumption is actually preserving the community's public safety interest, or if it's something that's actually just justifying locking up a lot more people who are involved in the criminal justice system due to a variety of reasons, including, being over policed and things like that. For us, we think that these risk assessment tools just end up reinforcing kind of the flawed decision making processes that judges are already using in the courtroom, which is just actually doing a much rougher estimate of whether or not I'm going to see this person again in my courtroom, and then saying, okay, well, I do think I'm going to see this person again. Let's go ahead and lock them up because I don't want them to be a risk to the community.
All right. So, talking about judges in this context of the pretrial assessments leads me to thinking about your more recent
Mm-hmm.
research and the paper and presentation that you published just recently around studying up,
Mm-hmm.
and how you looked at studying up coming out of anthropology and then leading that into the world of data science, and especially in the criminal justice system. So can you talk a little bit about how you made that progress moving through to this new way of looking at the problem?
Sure. So the paper we wrote around this idea of studying up was the byproduct of a collaboration I've done with a really interdisciplinary group of scholars. So it was comprised of me, who's like a sociologist, a lawyer, and two data scientists, Colin Doyle, J.B. Rabinovitz, and Karthik Dinakar. And what we were really wanting to do was, we were noticing that pretrial risk assessments was one of these prototypical case studies that had been picked up by the computer science community and the technology industry more broadly, of kind of, I guess, what they understood to be the limitations of AI and automated decision making. So pretrial risk assessments is one of these examples because it's a high stakes decision making realm, where people's lives are really going to be impacted by the decisions to incarcerate somebody, but also, the decision to release somebody who we think of as a threat to the community. It's an area where we know there are a lot of racial disparities, and those racial disparities are growing. And it's been discovered that these risk assessments, kind of reflect back and perhaps even amplify these types of limitations. Risk assessment's a great case study of that. It's certainly not the only one. Similar conversations have been going on around things like facial recognition software and the way that those perform differently on different groups of people according to their skin tone, their gender presentation, and things like that. Um, for voice recognition, also realizing that things like Alexa don't perform as well for different types of accents and things like that. So there are a number of places where people have realized that these tools perform in biased manners, um, and um, and as a result, we're now trying to figure out how do we debias these systems in various ways. Um, the group of researchers that I was working with, we kind of came together and said, I think the issue of bias is really important, um, and it's something we need to address, but it's actually not the biggest issue that we're facing. when we're thinking about the potential harm and the negative social consequences that could come out of these systems. And so what we decided to do was we tried to look at other disciplines from prior eras of history that have also had to who've come to similar conclusions in their work that perhaps actually, bias and this idea of like an objective view on the world was actually not the key issue at hand. And what we found was that actually anthropologists during the civil rights era, during the peak of in the rise of the Cold War in the 60s and the 70s, were actually having very similar conversations to what we see data scientists having today. And what I mean by that is that there were also, during that period of time, a number of high-profile controversies in which anthropologists and the research that they developed were implicated in all kinds of kind of high-profile, high social stakes events that were happening at the time. So anthropologists were coming under fire for working with the Department of State on overthrowing, for example, democratically elected governments in Latin America. Anthropologists were a part of justifying a new regime of policing practices and surveillance of civil rights leaders in the United States. And so there were very similar conversations going on about what are the ethical stakes and what's our ethical responsibility as academics in the field of anthropology in terms of either upending or reinforcing, I guess, really deeply entrenched social problems. And one of the specific conversations that came out of that period of time was started by a woman named Laura Nader, who's an anthropologist, who's pointed out that actually anthropologists in general tend to have a very specific and narrow view on how to best study and address social problems like poverty or racial discrimination. And that approach always tends to focus on studying the most marginalized and disempowered people within a society, or people who are often conceived of as the problem when you're kind of thinking of your research question. And what she called for her fellow anthropologists to do was to actually broaden their lens of analysis to kind of think about things like poverty within the context of wealth and how wealth gets generated in a place. How does wealth end up getting extracted from some communities and then feeding into others? She encouraged people to think about issues such as like formerly colonized countries and their underdevelopment as not an issue isolated to the culture of that country, but as something that must be contextualized within the relationships of colonization and the ongoing relationship between the colonizer and the colonized. So very broadly speaking, the call to study up was this call to really contextualize challenging social events, social struggles of the time within these types of relationships of historical oppression, exploitation, and things like that. And what we tried to do as a group was draw parallels between that conversation in the 60s and 70s. And I guess what we see is a very similar moment in history for computer scientists today, whose technologies are being embedded in a number of high stakes realms where we have deep, trenchant social problems in place. Things like chronic poverty, chronic violence, chronic drug use, and things like that. And what we said was that much like the anthropologists of the 60s and 70s, data scientists have tended to hyper focus the way they've defined the problem, and as well as their vision for how their technology can solve that problem in terms of the behaviors of the most marginalized factions of society. And pretrial risk assessments are a great case study to kind of look at that. So going back to what we were talking about before, pretrial risk assessments have really been really emerged on the scene as a solution to the problem of mass pretrial incarceration. Since the 1980s, we've seen a really massive increase in the number of people that we've chosen to put behind bars before they've even been convicted of a crime. And that's in spite of the fact that we've had declining violent crime rates, declining crime rates overall. So the issue here is that we've had judges have started to decide to put more people behind bars, even though it doesn't look like we have, any sort of increases in those crime rates. And the solution that we've come up with is one in which we try to model and predict the behavior of defendants rather than one in which we try to understand and model the behavior of the judges who are actually making those decisions. And for us, that tendency to just focus on predicting the behavior of defendants is very similar to the tendency that the anthropologists had in the civil rights era of hyper focusing on also poor and marginalized folks, as opposed to understanding and modeling the behavior of the people or the organizations and institutions that are actually probably driving those social outcomes down the line.
Yeah, you've talked before about there's two things that come up for me. One is you talk about the asymmetric power relations, right? That exist, and I think that's what's fascinating is pulling that out of the work that you've done in the criminal justice system, which clearly has an asymmetric power relation, but then drawing that forward into more broadly the field of data science, right? In terms of where the data is coming from, who it's being collected for. Sort of there's those people whose data is being collected, and there's those people for whom the data is being collected. And I find that to be a fascinating thing to sort of come from that research and more broadly. And I can see the pattern recognition that attracted you in looking at what happened 50 years ago in the anthropology world to today, and the sort of the call to people to think more carefully about the problem framing. You have I love the quote that you used at the beginning of your presentation from Einstein, that if you had an hour to solve a problem, you'd spend the first 55 minutes figuring out what the right question is. And of course, it's ironic here that I'm fielding a question and taking up a lot of time trying to figure out what the perfect question is. But I think that perhaps it's sort of interesting to dig in a little bit more on the sort of question of asymmetric power relations and how you've thought about taking that from the criminal justice focus into a more broadly of how data scientists or AI world should be thinking about that.
Sure. I mean, so this work was really kind of the culmination of our thinking after really honestly a series of failed attempts at engaging at a very practical level in this conversation of how could data best be used to serve pre-trial reform across the country. So as I mentioned, we were a pretty unique group of academics who were able to come together, a lawyer who had deep expertise in, the constitutional protections around pretrial release and bail, two data scientists, and then myself, who's a social scientist. And as a group, we were really interested in working both with governments as well as with community organizations to try to understand how can we use the data that's been collected by the courts to really drive, I guess, what you might consider evidence-based reform to really ultimately get to a place where we're incarcerating much fewer people who don't need to be incarcerated before their trial. And what we found was that the opportunities that are presented and made available for people who have the ability to analyze data are very much shaped by, I guess, these gatekeeper relationships, right? So the only organizations that have the capacity and the resources to be able to collect a lot of data about how decisions are being made are our courts. Those organizations have a very specific understanding of what are good research questions to ask to drive, lower incarceration rates, and what are, politically risky or inappropriate questions to ask. And we learned this the hard way because in somewhat of a naive way, as people who hadn't spent a lot of time in the space, we sort of said, it doesn't really make sense to us given, these risk assessments don't seem very good at predicting defendant behavior. They don't perform very accurately. And ProPublica has shown us that actually they're really biased. So, but could we use this data in another way? Could we use it, for example, to understand how judges have made decisions over time and how different, pretrial bail reforms around the country are changing the way they're making decisions? And make some informed decision about what types of policies, what types of legislation are actually moving judges in the right direction in terms of releasing more people from jail. And through doing that work and trying to collaborate with a couple of different governments and things like that, what we found is it's actually very hard to ask questions about judges and their behavior. But it's very easy to use the very exact same data to ask questions about defendants' behavior. So what I think that represents kind of more broadly is, in general, there are only a few particular types of organizations, ones with a lot of money, a lot of resources and capacity, who even have the ability to do data science or implement artificial intelligence as it currently stands, because these systems are so data hungry, and only a few organizations have that kind of data, and that, as a result, really powerfully shapes the types of systems that get built, because those organizations are going to be most interested in building systems that help maintain their authority, their decision making kind of power as it currently is, and doesn't really implicate them in the problem directly. So in the case of pretrial reform, it's very tough to build a model of judges' behavior.
So we end up with a system that's using data about the accused because that data is available, and because the accused doesn't have any ability to stop people from accessing that data and creating a prediction system based on it, rather than analyzing the data about judges, because that data is hard for you to get access to, and you document that. But at the same time, you found in your work that, at least when you were doing the analysis of the accused actions.
Right. So there's two challenges to studying people in power. One is that there often isn't data, like we don't collect data about judges, not explicitly at least. So where you're not going to see any courtroom that's monitoring explicitly the behavior of judges and trying to, figure out, have they done every due process step that they're supposed to take before, setting this bail amount or whatever. Organizations aren't interested in collecting that kind of information. That's one issue. But the other big challenge is that some data, lots of data, all data actually, is data that we assign meaning to. And and really we could interpret and assign meaning to that data in a variety of different ways. But we end up framing that data often in terms of people who don't have any power to resist the way we're kind of characterizing that data. And what I mean by that is we built a judge risk assessment tool that predicts the likelihood that a judge will unlawfully detain somebody prior to their trial by abusing bail practices, meaning they'll set a bail for somebody that they can't pay, and as a result, that person has to stay in jail. That's actually against the law, but it's something that's widely done. We built that risk assessment to predict the judge's behavior using court data. So courts, we took historical data about how judges had made decisions about different cases, and we used that data to basically make this assessment. Typically, that data that we used is used to make that exact same data is what's used to make defendant risk assessment tools or these other pretrial public safety tools that are widely used. And what we did is we took that same data and we reinterpreted whose behavior is reflected by this data. And we had a kind of a theory of power around that. Our theory was that, if you mapped out who really has the most agency and whose decisions and behaviors are really driving the outcomes in the criminal justice system, it's really judges who are setting these bail amounts. It's prosecutors who are asking or charging people with certain crimes, asking for certain bail amounts. It's really not defendants. Defendants don't have a lot of power in how these outcomes end up playing out over time. So rather than using this data to try to predict their behavior, we should understand this data is really the byproduct of the powerful people's decisions, and we can use it as a result. So there is potential to be able to do that. It's not like there is no data about judges. It's just that the default mode of interpreting that data tends to be to characterize it in terms of the people with the least amount of agency in the system.
We spend a lot of time thinking about agency, and when designing AI systems, what is the impact on individuals' agency. And what you're drawing out here is that the data is actually drawn from those who don't have agency, rather than the more accurate data would have been understanding the data of those who do have agency. And then flipping that around and designing a system, well, clearly that's going to have an impact on how the system operates and who benefits and who doesn't benefit from it. And you end up in this sort of twisted logic sense of it. Just to pull it out of the criminal justice system, it's fascinating to think about. If you're going to be designing an AI system in a corporation, let's say it's helping a customer service team, there will be data that exists about the people on the front lines because they're on the phone, they're being recorded, their KPIs are being tracked, all of that kind of information. But there won't be the same level of data or access to data to those who are actually in power of how that team operates. You go all the way up to the C-suite and the VP of customer service. Mm-hmm. There isn't much data there. Or if it is data there, it's not accessible to those who are creating the models. Mm-hmm. And so I find this, that what you're drawing out of asking data scientists to think more carefully about how they frame the problem and asking them to think more carefully about how they understand who's in power. It's not just a question of who's going to get the recommendation or who's the prediction going to be about, but it's really tracing it all the way back to where does the data even come from? And that's clearly a challenge. Data scientists inside a corporate, it's a, well, there's this message of let's get some AI. Great. Okay, so we got some data scientists, or we've got some data in a data lake, or go figure out what exhaust data is being kicked out of this company and go figure out what you can do with it. And so the project is designed to figure out what kind of accurate predictions can be drawn from the data that exists, mm-hmm. which you have to stop and go back and say, well, is that data that exists? Is that the right data that we want? Is that the data that's actually representing the right group in terms of the asymmetric power relations that exist?
Right. And you're totally right that, most of data science is something that happens opportunistically, right? We have data sets are created right. for one purpose. They're often, it's just the byproduct of administration often, right? Like the court records were not collected in the first place for a data science project. These records were generated to keep track of cases over time. But what we've done is mm-hmm. now we have that data available, and now people are wanting to use it and use it to interpret and make forecasts about future events. And what we're really interested in is bringing in some sort of theory of power, some sort of theory of, differential agency to how we think about whose behavior is reflected in this data that has been collected. Who does it tell us about? Particularly when we see issues like bias pop up, I think we need, or different levels of performance and accuracy for different groups of people. That's a situation in which we really, I think, should be going back to the table and asking, okay, let's think thoughtfully about what this data generation process is about and what exactly is going on when we say there's bias here. I think another really example of where this has happened outside of the criminal justice context is within the medical field. So within medicine, very similar kinds of audits have been done on algorithms, for example, in hospitals, often for triaging scarce medical resources and figuring out, okay, when does somebody need to be elevated into the intensive care unit and things like that. Algorithms are often used to monitor and figure out, okay, which patients are our highest risk patients and need more care. One of these algorithms that's used in hospitals in that way, it was discovered what they used to measure risk was how much money was being spent on that patient, with the idea being the more money that's being spent on the patient, the more serious their illness is. And so cost per patient was a proxy for sickness and health risk overall. And what they found was with that risk assessment, on average, the African Americans who are rated as moderate or high risk were much sicker than the white patients who are rated as moderate or high risk. And what that revealed was actually this proxy, how much money is being spent on this patient, actually wasn't a proxy for how healthy or sick that patient was. It was, how much money has this doctor decided, how much resources has this doctor decided to allot towards this type of patient? And what the risk assessment actually ended up revealing was that systematically, doctors assign and provide less care for African American patients than they do for white patients. So actually surfacing bias in the algorithm and realizing, oh wow, these African American patients are much sicker than the white patients coming in, led to a reframing of what this data could tell us, away from identifying which patients are the sickest and towards how do we mitigate the bias and or like the differences and the decisions that doctors make in how much care and how much treatment, how much resources to provide for patients.
That is fascinating. That is quite fascinating. And so I really love the way that you've your work has focused in clearly on and the impact that it can have on the criminal justice system. And I really appreciate and I'm grateful that the work that you've done, you've found ways to extend that more broadly,
Mm-hmm.
because these power dynamics and the requirement for good problem framing exists across the entire world of AI.
Mm-hmm.
But what you've been able to do is focus in on an area that I find to be quite important from a societal perspective, where there is so clearly these power relations that can be drawn out,
Mm-hmm.
and the impact of your research can hopefully have some impact in the world of the incarcerated. But the lessons learned can hopefully have a broader impact across all other systems where they're still dealing with these same sort of power dynamics. I'm curious. One final question for you is, what's next in your work? What are you working on next?
So I think there's two big chunks of work we're doing. One is I think continuing forward with this studying of work. So I think in response to the paper that we wrote and the presentation we gave in January, we have had a number of people reach out just to actually kind of think with them about what would it mean to study up within my particular domain or context. And that has been both really interesting and really challenging because the area we know best is the criminal legal system. And so it's very easy for me to tell you what it would look like to study the police as opposed to neighborhoods, or study prosecutors as opposed to defendants, or study judges as opposed, that area is really easy. It's much harder for me to think about that within the context of education or medicine. And so what we're actually doing right now is we're actually bringing together and curating a set of case studies from people who are either, for whom like this idea of studying up is bringing language to the work that they were in fact doing, and but now can see a much clearer focus, or for people who are really trying to grapple with this and trying to pivot within their own context how they would engage as data scientists in those realms. And so we are in the process of trying to kind of put together a set of case studies for that. And so that we can make this more concrete, and perhaps provide a more a high level framework for how people would bring an explicit kind of analysis around power and agency to their work in different domains. Another big, I think, question that is going to come out of doing those case studies is, what are the types of interventions that data scientists can do to change the conversations of how AI can help in different contexts? Because the reality is, we tend to study down or study people with less power because it's easier. More opportunities are made available to people. There's more excitement. There's more funding to study things in a way that that people with the resources and with the access to the data want to study it. And so we're also digging into, I guess, another concept from anthropology and trying to figure out how that applies to data science. And that concept is the concept of refusal, which is also kind of a critical race feminist kind of theory around what it means to ethically engage in work, and how do we both refuse or reject harmful modes of engaging, and then point to an alternative directions in doing and like other ways of viewing the data that's available to us, reimagining what it can tell us down the line. So I think we might also start to dig into other concepts like refusal from anthropology, and also try to put together some case studies of what it means to change the conversation when the in politically sensitive or high stakes environments, like education and medicine and things like that. Yeah, that's where we're going next. Is just really trying to bring together, I guess, a community of people who really want to think about the political economy of their work as data scientists and how to ethically engage at the level of uh, forming questions within organizations, within different contexts, and how to navigate the sensitivities of that when those questions directly involve institutions and people in positions of authority.
I'm very much looking forward to that work. I think the concept of refusal is quite important. I'll go broadly enough to think about the ability, the ability of platforms to basically overrule any sense of refusal. So I'm very much looking forward to seeing what you do with that and staying in touch. And I will put in the show notes in ways for listeners to track what you're doing and following your work. Very much appreciate your time. You've been quite generous. It's been a fascinating conversation, and thank you very much.
Thanks so much for having me. It's been really fun to talk.